Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Metallica record, 72 Seasons. In the year of our Lord 2023, it is so easy to make fun of Metallica without even getting a slight side eye at anything that you say about them, about virtually any release that they've ever put out over the course of their career. I mean, sure, everything from their 1983 Raw debut Kill 'Em All to their 1988 progressive thrash metal classic And Justice for All is legendary to this very day and considered rightfully to be some of the best metal ever put out into the musical world. And their 1991 self-titled album, although not a personal favorite of mine by any means, managed to achieve a degree of mainstream success arguably never seen by any metal album before or afterwards. But records like Saint Anger, which have been extremely poorly received, and the infamous Lou Reed collaboration Lulu have not necessarily put Metallica in the best standings for newer generations and younger listeners in the 21st century. So, needless to say, the days of Metallica being considered the best band to ever play instruments has long since passed. Nonetheless, despite the fact that they are not necessarily the most consistent band on the planet, Metallica surely have a great album, or at least a very good album, swimming around somewhere in their collective creative mindset, and we can only pray that this comes to fruition at some point, because 72 Seasons, despite trying to be a reasonably epic return for Metallica after quite a while since their last studio album, it just does not feel like the real thing. If anything, 72 Seasons is just another flop in one of the most remarkable downhill slopes in the history of music across the board. Metallica have sounded dispassionate and bored of themselves now for many years at this point. However, previous releases from the band have managed to mutate this in a amusing and often memorable way. For example, Saint Anger, a record that is widely despised yet still hugely remembered for its infamous snare drum sound and some terrible lyricism, among other things. But nonetheless, it's a record that is remembered, despite the fact that it is less than beloved to say the least. The issue with 72 Seasons isn't that it's laughably bad, though, like records such as the aforementioned Saint Anger and Lulu, or albums like Reload. It's the fact that 72 Seasons is completely unremarkable in every single way possible. There's truly nothing striking about this record at all in any sense. I mean, really, there's not a single performance-related quality throughout the entirety of this album's runtime that is even remotely memorable in any way, and that comes from an individual that listened to this record several times to firmly get a grasp on it before reviewing it. Lars Ulrich's drumming on tracks like Chasing Light verges on sloppy here and there, as it has for quite a while at this point, if I'm being totally honest, but at the same time, there is such a lack of enthusiasm behind the kit here that it's difficult to make fun of the man's work, even. It's really hard to mock him as a whole. There's not a lot to really make fun of here, as he's not really putting a ton of passion into a poor performance or anything like that. There's nothing that really energizes the average listener to really dig into why he performs so weakly here. It's just a mediocre and unenthused performance from a drummer that seemingly does not want to be drumming for Metallica anymore. James Hetfield and Kirk Hammett's guitar work can range anywhere from mind-numbing to downright bad regarding riff work, and the soloing found throughout this album is poor to say the least, with how slapdash and completely pointless the vast majority of the guitar solos here can feel, with tracks like the lead single Lux Eterna just having guitar solos that feel pointless. They go nowhere, they add nothing to the songs themselves, and even worse than that, they feel underdeveloped as actual interludes within the context of the songs themselves. They just feel like a single take was made, and then they just said, yeah, sure, that goes on the album, I guess. And that there wasn't actually thought being put into why these guitar solos were being put into songs, or how these guitar solos were going to go. And although not every instrumental solo requires deep structure or musical theory to be great, in fact, at times, a lack of structure can ultimately add to the rawness of an instrument solo, there are times where there needs to be some sense of structure for things to work, because the instrumentalists themselves is not capable of creating something particularly raw, and neither Hetfield nor Hammett are Jimi Hendrix. They are solid guitar players, no doubt, in their best moments, and in fact, in their greatest moments, they are downright fantastic. But when they truly just don't have any love or passion for what they're doing, see this album, it just all turns out mediocre at best. Hetfield's vocal performance is especially weak, which is a genuine disappointment, as although it is easy to make fun of James Hetfield's delivery style and some of his talk-singing moments, he is a fairly charismatic frontman as a whole, and has been one of the few saving graces of Metallica over the years, even if he does deliver some pretty horrible lyrics from time to time. But nonetheless, 72 Seasons doesn't even have some half-solid vocal work from him, with a confidence-lacking performance that really seems like he's trying to lead Metallica while also not waking up his parents in the room right next to the recording studio. It just really doesn't feel like it's James Hetfield giving his all, but then again that only fits considering 72 Seasons sounds like it's Metallica not giving their all. Bassist Robert Trujillo really deserves a mention solely based on the fact that he is an official member of this band. His name's in the credits, and somewhere on this album there is bass. I've yet to find it, but it is on here somewhere to be sure. I mean, really, he's a competent bassist, but removing bass lines from 72 Seasons is just about the most useless thing that you could possibly do. It just would make no difference in the final product of the record. The bass lines here are non-existent. Not that it would really make the album so much better if they weren't. This isn't an Injustice for All situation. This is a 72 Seasons situation, where the bass lines feel like they don't exist, but then again, actual care or love for the record that is being created also doesn't feel like it exists. So take that for what you will. All of this is just to say that if there were a foot race for the most unenthusiastic performance by any metal band this year, Metallica would be the musical equivalent of Usain Bolt. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say that. Across the board, indie bands, alternative underground bands, whatever you want to call it, or major label bands like Metallica, there may very well not be a single metal album, or at the very least a single major metal album that comes out in 2023 that just sounds so dull in the same way that 72 Seasons does. The production behind 72 Seasons certainly doesn't help Metallica at all. This record was produced primarily by Greg Feidelman, an individual who has really worked behind the scenes with a number of artists in a variety of different positions. His prior collaborations range from, but aren't exclusive to, Rage Against the Machine, Slipknot, and Johnny Cash, as well as Adele. The man really has a history with a number of artists across a multitude of genres, and more importantly than that, Feidelman has also worked with Metallica on some of their more recent releases, including 2016's Hardwired to Self-Destruct, the album that precedes 72 Seasons. Despite the fact that Feidelman is capable at his job in the producer's chair for releases by a number of other artists, his own personal polished style mixed with the mastering of industry legend Bob Ludwig just does not suit Metallica as a band, and it hasn't on prior releases either. On one hand, it's genuinely nice to see that the quartet aren't necessarily hellbent on creating the same raw looseness that was found on their mid to late 80s output, but at the same time, the general smoothness of albums like 72 Seasons just does not fit Metallica's style whatsoever. They do not mesh with it, and ultimately the bands sound thin in turn. Any bite left in Metallica's sound after progressively losing their touch over multiple decades is just completely drained from this record thanks to weak production, and maybe in a better timeline, in a different timeline at least, Metallica would be able to come out with a great album in 2023 that would be a solid take by an older legendary band on a refreshed and refined, but still true to themselves sound. That timeline and the timeline in which I'm recording this review are not the same timeline at all. To be totally frank, 72 Seasons would have been a completely harmless, albeit extremely boring Metallica album if it just had a reasonable runtime. I mean, considering the music, the style, and sound of Metallica in the modern day, A 40 to 45 minute, 50-minute even, long album would be enough to please the rabid hordes of metalheads and pickup truck driving Metallica diehards out there, at least enough to hold them over for a little while until Metallica decide to tour for the same boring music again. 72 Seasons is slightly over 77 minutes in length, which is excessive even for a band that hasn't released an album in 7 years, even for a legendary band that hasn't released an album in 7 years. Frankly, no Metallica album should be this long. Perhaps the biggest crime here is the fact that they didn't make the album 72 minutes long. All it would have required is just cutting off a few minutes of fat, which is the majority of this record, so that would have been pretty easy, and probably the most clever thing Metallica have done in decades, so missed opportunity. Between unnecessary and unneeded filler songs like Shadows Follow, for example, that really just add an increased runtime to the record that nobody is asking for, and weak tracks that nonetheless at least feel somewhat important to the overall development of the narrative of the album, such as the single If Darkness Had a Sun, for example, there just is too much music and too much material on this album for 72 Seasons to really hold its own in the context of both Metallica's discography and metal as a whole. With a nearly 80-minute long runtime, the four-piece managed to dig up a few minutes of decency, I suppose, roughly 35 minutes of relative mediocrity, and another 40 minutes, 35 minutes, give or take, of downright yawn-inducing dreck that feels entirely unwarranted. In fact, 72 Seasons as an album just feels like a completely unnecessary record that didn't need to come out in general. Maybe an EP would have been fine. Look, dismissing a new Metallica album and referring to it as inessential because of their age or their quote-unquote legacy status would be ignorant and overly dismissive even of their abilities as musicians. However, a bloated album that feels as creatively drained as 72 Seasons does really does drive home the point that Metallica are easily one of the most creatively unimportant and inessential major metal acts in the modern day, which is kind of strange considering Master of Puppets era Metallica was the exact opposite. How Metallica have gone from being one of the most vital metal bands on the planet to this is kind of beyond me. I mean, I get it, bands change, but usually not in this way. I mean, obviously, in terms of cultural impact and popularity, Metallica are as relevant as ever. In fact, you could argue that they've never been more relevant than they are right now, today, or at least today is the most relevant they've been since the self-titled album era. But nonetheless, that does not necessarily translate over to the quality of music itself or the quality of their creative abilities, and generally speaking, it just does not feel like they needed to make new music. Perhaps it's too much to ask a band that is going on nearly 45 years of existence to put out something as great as their early work, and in this case, some of their peak work. The fact of the matter is Metallica will never release another Ride the Lightning, and chances are they probably won't drop another And Justice for All anytime soon either. And you know what? That's okay. Metallica truly are at a point where they can do absolutely anything they want, and people probably won't question it unless it has something to do with Napster. But other than that, they're pretty much golden to do whatever they feel like. Fans and critics alike have claimed that Metallica are now at a sort of final phase of their career, where they have quote-unquote nothing left to prove. With that being said, I can't help but raise one question. Between their success as a touring band, their success in terms of merchandise, and the fact that the four members of Metallica's collective wealth could probably feed a small nation of starving people, why put out new music when you have nothing left to say at all? I mean, look, I get it when some older indie or alternative band that needs to make new music to make their money off of their art puts out something new, even if they aren't super charged up creatively or anything. I completely understand that, but Metallica have made their millions at this point, and although I understand them possibly wanting to please their fan base, I can't imagine why they would think that this would really do the trick. This is ridiculously dull. If 72 Seasons manages to prove anything at all on Metallica's part, it's that some bands are better off letting their legacies speak for themselves, rather than continuously trying to build upon them. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.